It's now my pleasure to introduce the first of 4 superb keynote speakers we've got lined up for you over the next couple of days. Greg Dyke will be known to many in this room in a number of guises. The former Director General of the BBC and a media expert, having also worked with the LWT Group, Pearson Television and Channel 5. He's held the positions of Chancellor of York University and Chairman of HIT, which is a children's television production company. Greg is also Fellow of the Royal Television Society and a non-exec chairman of Brentford Football Club, as well as former chairman of the Football Association. But the main reason he's here to talk to us today is because he is a real live hotel owner and operator and chairs his Vine Hotels company. Having built up five properties in his portfolio alongside that career in broadcasting, he has embraced and no doubt driven change and seized opportunities. Please give a rousing AHC welcome to Greg Dyke.
Good morning. I always have to pull the mic down a bit. In fact, when I was at the BBC, I got a phone call one day from Buckingham Palace, and we were going to a reception there that evening, and they said, someone's got to give the presentation to the Queen, and would you do it? And I said, yeah, right. So I turned up and I gave her a piece of broadcasting equipment that I didn't know what it was. She certainly didn't know what it was, but we went through the process and I gave it to them. And then she wandered off, and I called the PR man over. I said, why did you want me to do that? And they said, we needed somebody short. Anyway, good morning, and thank you for inviting me to give this keynote speech at the start of your conference. Now, no one has invited me here today because of my intimate knowledge of the hotel business. If by chance they have, I fear they're going to be disappointed. It is true that late in life I have got into owning hotels rather than just staying in them, but my background is in television, theatre, movies, sport, a bit in academia, and owning golf clubs. Now, you might think, why golf clubs? Well, like so much of my life, it was by accident. I didn't mean to buy my first golf club, which was in Dartmouth in Devon. I was trying to buy the development land around the club, but ended up with a lot by mistake. After 20 years, I still own it. As a very average golfer myself, I'm always amused by the stories which emerge from the club at Dartmouth, like the day Dennis Waterman came to play, and surprise, surprise, he managed to drink quite a lot. And the day ended with a naked Waterman wandering around the corridors, having locked himself out of his room, all, of course, recorded on CCTV. Then there was the day we got a frogman down to look for balls in the lake. In one day, he found 22,000 balls, and the joke was that most of them were mine. And finally, there was the tipsy golfer who drove his buggy into the lake and tried to sue us for not having safety barriers around it. In fact, the story of how I got into hotels is quite similar to golf, and it's probably worth telling briefly, as I say, because so much of my life it wasn't planned. It was a decade or so ago, and I was persuaded by a close mate to help a friend of his by lending him the money to buy this hotel, which is Mosborough Hall Hotel just outside of Sheffield. That's how it looks today, because we spent more than £3 million on it. Back in 2005, it looked more like this, I think. Like many things in my life, I ended up, as I say, as the 100% owner by chance. Having lent the money, I discovered that the person I'd lent it to was, to put it politely, not good with money. I could use much stronger language, like he was a complete crook, but as a lifelong journalist, I'm aware of the laws of libel. Anyway, I was a silent investor owning 50% of the hotel, leaving my so-called partner to run it. I should point out that he hadn't put much money into the hotel, but he had offered his house as security against some of the bank loans. Out of the blue, he rang me one day and said that the bank was foreclosing at the end of the week unless I put more money in immediately. That was the first I'd heard of it. He went on to explain that he had no money, and what did I want to do? So my choice was either forget it and write off the few $100,000 I'd lent to the business, or try to save my investment. Now, by nature, I am an optimist. I'm always surprised if things go wrong, so I decided to stick with it and invest some more cash. But this time I decided to do it without my so-called partner. So I told him that I would only put more money in and save the business if, in short, he buggered off. He didn't have a lot of choice about going because otherwise I wasn't going to invest and he would have lost his house. But it's worth pointing out that he didn't lose any money, probably the opposite. So overnight I took over all the liabilities, plus I put in the extra cash the bank wanted, which meant I was now in the hotel business without, I must admit, knowing anything about it at all. I suppose I thought it couldn't be that difficult. How wrong I was. My lack of any experience showed, and it took some time for us to sort out the issues we found at the Mosborough Hall Hotel. We had one or two small domestic issues. We had to sack the manager after he thumped the chef in a fight in the car park. I suspect he's not alone amongst hotel managers in wanting to thump the chef at some time or another, but you're not allowed to do it. Even Jeremy Clarkson discovered that. We had to finish a 30-room extension, which had been half built without proper building regulations and without the cash to finish it. The bank had put up the money, but somehow, somewhere, it had disappeared. But our problems didn't end there. Someone stole most of the lead off the roof of the old house. We nearly lost our liquor license. English Heritage complained we weren't looking after the 13th century hall properly, and we had to placate the neighbours, the planners, and most of all the staff, who were all, to say the least, pissed off. But we persevered, and we got into building the rather beautiful bar you can see, which joined up the old hall and the newish bedroom block. But even that didn't go smoothly. We had an inspired architect. I do think it was a beautiful design, who was great on design, but he wasn't good on floor levels. One end didn't quite meet the other end, or controlling costs. We also had an engineer telling us one part of the old hall would collapse if we took out a beam, which had only been there for 20 years. I just ignored him and took the beam out anyway. The hall's still there. But when I look back now, it's clear to me that financially, the hotel only survived for 3 reasons. Firstly, we were one of the few hotels to benefit massively from the economic crisis in 2008, because although we lost a lot of customers, like everybody, we did have a lot of bank borrowing, and the dramatic drop in interest rates saved us. Secondly, Mosborough is a wedding hotel, and despite the recession, people in Sheffield seem to want to get married in ever greater numbers. And finally, I met Garin Davis and Andrew Rouse. There they are, like sort of Morecambe and Wise, really, I suppose, for the business, who did know how to run hotels, and I gave their management company, then called Longrose, a management contract to take over responsibility for it. After a great deal of effort, particularly from Garin, from Paul Brown, the new hotel manager, and the staff, the hotel was turned around. In the years since then, Saxon Hotels, my company, which owns Mosborough, has bought a second hotel called Cutler's, which is right in the centre of Sheffield, and taken over the running of an upmarket wedding venue on the other side of town called Worlowbrook Hall. We now have a thriving business. What I think this story shows is that when you employ people who know what they are doing and combine it with a great chunk of luck, you can turn a business around, as long as the cash flow doesn't kill you first, or the lack of it. Now, in the last couple of years, Gary and Andrew and I have set up another company called Vine Hotels, which has expanded very quickly, but I'll tell you more of that later. But first, I'll tell you something about the rest of my life. Strange thing happened to me recently when I got an email from a mate asking me, had I seen a book published last year by a guy called Peter Pugh. The book was called The 50 Most Influential Britons of the Last 100 Years. I explained to my friend that it wasn't the sort of book I read, and he said, well, you ought to read it, you're in it. I was a bit surprised. The only similar book I could recall ever being in was called The 50 People Who Buggered Up Britain, which was written by Quentin Letts, the Daily Mail journalist, and I was number 16 on his list of the people who'd buggered up Britain. I was included because Letts used to watch the 9 o'clock news on BBC One and then go to bed. And he put me in the book because when I was Director General of the BBC, I was the person who moved the BBC's 9 o'clock news to 10 o'clock, which meant poor old Quentin either had to miss the news or go to bed later. My reaction to being in that book was to realise what a sad bastard Quentin Letts must be if he has to go to bed at 9:30. I decided that was his problem, not mine, and it's time he got a real life. Anyway, back to Peter Pugh's book. I ordered the book and discovered I was number 30 in the list of the 50 most influential Britons of the last 100 years. Just 15 places behind the Queen and 10 behind Winston Churchill. I was, to say the least, surprised. And I was also surprised to find myself ahead of David Hockney, Alan Turing, and Alfred Hitchcock, to name but 3. For the life of me, I couldn't think why I would be in the book. So I, like everybody does with books, immediately look up the bit about them. And the first paragraph said, Greg Dyke has been selected not because of his time as Director General of the BBC, but thanks to his part in creating the Premier League in 1992. So it was all down to football. And while it's probably true that the Premier League wouldn't have happened when it did without me that year, I don't think it mattered that much. I disagree with the old Liverpool manager Bill Shankly when he said, football isn't life and death, it's more important than that. In truth, it's only a game, even if these days it's a very rich game, thanks to me, according to Mr. Pugh. Anyway, 25 years on from the creation of the Premier League, I am not at all sure that I'm that proud of what we created, although there was no way we could have known back then what it would look like 25 years later. Because the Premier League is without doubt the world's top football league and is Britain's biggest sporting export. Go to any part of the world and you can find matches live on the telly. I was in Uganda last year and we were stopped for speeding. And I asked the policeman which team he supported and he said, Manchester United. I explained that I too was a United fan and had been on the board of the club for 4 years back in the 90s. He was so excited, he let us off without having to give the normal bung, which is, how you deal with the police in Uganda. I'm not sure what picture we're now showing. Is it the one with the chickens? You might wonder why I put up there, because I quite like the picture. That was me in Uganda, where I went to a project I helped support, and they gave me 2 live chickens. And of course, you couldn't say no, but I had to go back to Kampala. So for 5 hours, we drove back to Kampala with 2 live chickens in the back of the car. And I thought then, actually, if we get stopped by the police, give them the 2 live chickens. Anyway, my problem with the Premier League today is this. Whilst the football played is wonderful, increasingly, the league has very little to do with England. These days, the top English football clubs are owned by foreigners, managed by foreigners, and 70% of the players are foreigners. Only the fans are Brits. This makes developing a decent England football team very difficult, as we've seen in the last week, and also means that many very talented young English kids, really talented, have very little chance of playing at the top level. I mean, up until last year, I spent 3 years as chairman of the Football Association, a job I should never have taken on. I knew the organisation was a mess where the men in blazers, those blokes, the old guys who sit there with their badges and the rest of it, they had too little ability and too much power, but I rather arrogantly thought I could change it. So I tried to change both the organisation and the number of foreigners playing in English football. I failed on both counts. But I'm not without hope that the latter could still be changed. Although I think Brexit could well be a disaster for this country, not something for me to pontificate about today, the one area where we could benefit is football. Because if we're not governed by the European Courts of Justice, the Football Association, if it's got the guts to stand up against the Premier League, could limit the number of European players playing in this country, which it can't at present. That might give our young players a real chance to progress. But that's enough of football. I've lived with a woman for 30 years who thinks football is an infantile pursuit designed for men who have nothing else meaningful to talk about. So I do understand that some in the audience today are not the slightest bit interested. So I thought I'd talk about television instead. I spent 30 years in the television business, starting as a researcher at London Weekend Television, where I eventually became the chief executive, and later at the BBC, where I was Director General. In fact, I only ever applied for 2 jobs at the BBC. The first was to be a reporter on Radio Teesside in 1970, a job I didn't get, and the second was as Director General in 1999, which I did get. And after 4 years at the BBC, my television career really came to a crashing end, largely due to a report on the Today programme which suggested that Tony Blair and his henchmen in Downing Street had sexed up the case for going to war in Iraq. A decade or so later, and after the publication of the Chilcot report, it's quite hard to find anyone who today thinks otherwise, apart from Tony Blair and Alistair Campbell, that is. But at the time, it was a very controversial and led to me being asked to leave by a bunch of gutless BBC governors who, when the things got rough, didn't have the guts to stand up to Blair and his people. So overnight, I went from having the best job in television, British television at the BBC, to having no job at all. Initially, I did what politicians do when they've been sacked. I announced I wanted to spend more time with my family. The trouble was, after about 6 months, I realised that my family didn't want to spend a lot more time with me. So instead, I got into what people call a portfolio life, which is a posh description of being unemployed. Now, the first thing I did in this new existence was to take on the role of Chancellor at my old university, the University of York. And we've got a picture there. If you can see it, that's me as a student. I was 24 when I went to university in 1974. I was the only student I knew who bought his own house. My poor old dad had just got a pension, and I borrowed some of that. The house behind me in that picture cost me £1,200 in 1974. When I sold it when I left for £5,000, but I should have kept it, of course, like we all should, because today it's worth nearly £200,000. Anyway, I only showed you that picture to show you this one, right? That's me as the Chancellor, the one with the yellow hat. Now, if anyone had said in 1974 that 30 years later I will be back as the university's Chancellor, I wouldn't have believed it. My fellow students wouldn't have believed it, and members of the administration would have been astonished. I'd gone from bolshy student activist to the titular head of the university in just 30 years. Anyway, that was the first job I took up in my new life. Now, the second was as a public speaker. For quite a long time, I was on the public speaker circuit being paid quite considerably large sums of money, not like today, I should add, to give talks. Now, my old friend David Frost explained to me at the time that if you did the speaker circuit, you always had to offer the organisers 3 subjects you were prepared to talk about, so they had a choice. It was only later I discovered that it didn't matter which one they chose in David's case, because he did the same speech anyway. The 3 subjects I offered were democracy, leadership, and weapons of mass destruction. And by and large, I found that people wanted me to talk about leadership, largely due to the events of a single day, the day I was thrown out of the BBC. See, on that day, literally thousands of my staff right across the country took to the streets to protest against my departure. Others had a whip round and raised more than £12,000 to pay for a page advert in the Daily Telegraph protesting against my leaving. The unions organised a protest march, which was ironic because it was the only helpful thing they did in the 4 years I was there. And in all, I received more than 6,000 emails from my staff saying they were sorry I'd left. I'll only read one. It says, "The only way I can come to terms with the extraordinary events of the last 48 hours is to pay testimony to the vision and energy you brought to the BBC. Men, women, even journalists cried today." Because it's all a bit self-serving, I should tell you that I did receive another one that just said, "Fuck off, Dyke, I never liked you anyway." But my staff didn't put that in the bound copies of the emails, which I've now got in my study. What was interesting was that almost everyone I knew who was running any sort of organisation on the day that the staff walked out in support of the boss, and of course, because it was the BBC, it was inevitably on the news, they asked themselves one question: would my staff do that for me? That's why I was invited by all sorts of organisations to speak out about leadership. They all wanted to know, how do you get that degree of loyalty and support from your staff? Now, I do a whole hour speech about that, but that's hardly appropriate for today. So let me go back to the hotel business. About 18 months ago, Garin, Andrew and I had by then got to know each other pretty well, and they seemed like good blokes. And we decided we'd go into business together to buy some hotels. At the time, I had quite a lot of spare cash because we just sold the Ambassador Theatre Group, which is the biggest theatre owner in Europe, probably, where I was chairman. It was bought by an American private equity company at what was a very attractive price, which meant I had cash to invest. We set up a company called Vine Hotels and set about looking for opportunities in the hotel business. In the next 12 months, we bought 4 hotels. I put some money into each purchase, but the vast bulk came from a very clever financial structure, which so far has proved to be very successful. Gary, Andrew and I discussed whether I should outline the structure here today, but we decided not to, on the grounds that we don't want some of you using our structure to compete with us the next time we're trying to buy a hotel. The 4 hotels we have bought so far are: first, we bought the Doubletree Hotel in Sheffield. Second, we bought the Dolphin Hotel in Southampton. Third came the Kenwood Hotel, also in Sheffield. And finally, we bought Cresta Court in nearby Altrincham. So what criteria did we use when deciding to buy hotels? Well, firstly, as you can see, we don't currently compete at the top end of the market. We consider the 3-4-star market to be the most commercially successful. It doesn't mean that we wouldn't look at other opportunities if they came up, but at the moment we haven't. Secondly, we look for hotels where there are further opportunities, either by building an extension on the hotel, as at the Doubletree, or by using spare land on the hotel site to build apartments or houses, as we are planning to do at both Kenwood and the Dolphin. Thirdly, we're only interested in a hotel if our financial model means that if there is another recession on the scale of the last one, the hotel would still be viable. We recently walked away from a deal precisely because it didn't meet that criteria. I mean, as an aside, what is clear is that some of the prices paid for hotels, it seems to me, at the height of the boom, were, to say the least, balmy. And if that world should return, we'll probably be sellers, not buyers. So as someone who has been involved in quite a few different businesses over the years, what's my impression of the hotel business? Well, it's not an easy business. And what I've discovered in quite a short period of time is that experienced management is essential. Operating hotels is complicated. It's not just about the quality of the steak, the make of coffee, or how comfortable the beds are, although all 3 do matter. But then you know that. Successful hotels need to be operated by experienced people with the use of, I think, of intricate financial models. Strong revenue management, dynamic online and face-to-face sales initiatives, budgeting, forecasting, and cost control have all got to be maintained at a high level if the business is to survive and thrive. Our models mean we are constantly looking forward, making assessments of what the business is looking like for the next week, the next month, the next 6 months, the next year, and adjusting our expenditure accordingly. The results so far are encouraging, and we are ahead of budget after the first half of this financial year in all 4 hotels. Vine Hotels is also involved in managing hotels owned by other people, including the Saxon Hotels in Sheffield, which I own, a second hotel in the northwest, and we're currently in discussions on taking over the management of several other hotels. What we have found is that our mix of strong and talented operational management, sophisticated financial modelling, and the aggressive focus to maximise revenue drives both the capital values of the hotels as well as the returns they achieve. To sum up then, I have a few reservations about the hotel business. I don't think, for those, and I see you're going to discuss it later, we should never underestimate the importance of the big hotel brands and the amount of business being part of those brands brings to us. We need them to help us counter what feels like the never-ending rise of online sales agencies and their enormous charges. Quite why we didn't all get together and jointly go into that business ourselves, I don't know, I wasn't around. But we didn't, and it's probably too late now, and well done to those who did. But it's a hard competitor. And then, of course, we don't really know the impact of the likes of Airbnb and where it will go in the future. We don't really know what the future is going to look like. But as a newcomer to a business, which many of you have been in for many years, my view is that the hotel sector is a great business to be in, solid asset backing, excellent returns, exciting opportunities, and over the medium term, decent growth prospects. That's me finished. I've agreed to take questions, but remember, I do know more about television, football, and theatre than I do about hotels. Thank you.
Great job, Greg. Thank you very much. We do have a few minutes for questions if there are any, or anybody has posted any online. Before those start to come in, Greg, how do you think football compares with the hotel industry?
Well, the hotel industry is quite interested in making profits, and football, by and large, isn't.
Really?
Well, apart from footballers, of course. I mean, you know, someone once asked me, why haven't we, you look at pay television in America, and you look at the amount of brilliant dramas that come out of it and the rest of it, and someone said to me, well, why haven't we got that in this country? And I said, because actually what happened is the advent of pay television, we gave all the money to footballers. And that's what we've done. I don't mind, Sky have got a very good business, but we didn't spend the money on drama, we gave it to football. But every time there's a new football deal on television, and every time it looks like the football clubs are going to make real money, actually they don't, because they just pay it off to the players. It all goes to the talent. It's not unlike, I was in the movie business for a while, it's not unlike the movie business where, you know, if in a movie you make a couple of percent, you're really excited, and you find out that the talent were taking 15 or 20 million, and they got that whether or not it was a success. So, first of all, football is not profit-oriented, although it is capital asset-oriented. I mean, if you look at, I was on the board of Manchester United when it nearly got sold to Sky. I was the one director who tried to fight it. And I think it would have been sold for 700 million. Today, it's probably 2.5 billion if you sell it. But they're assets to be bought and sold. And a lot of the people buying them, of course, are people who have made their money elsewhere. And they've made their money in one business only to, one could say, piss it away in another.
Sounds like hotels.
Well, it's not my experience of hotels so far, but then I'm early days.
I bet there are people in this room who wish more of the money would go to the talent as well in the hotel sector. Are there any questions? We'll take it the old-fashioned way. If anybody wants to put their hand up. Yep, there's one just over there. If we've got a microphone, can get there quickly, or you can shout loudly.
Here comes the mic.
Here comes the mic. If you'd let us know who you are and what your question is, thank you.
Sir, my name is Mohan Mulani. I want to know, how involved are you in your business right now, in the hotel business? And if you are, which aspect of the business are you focused on leveraging on your past experience and background?
What, now or then?
Right now.
Right now. Well, I'm the chairman. You've got to understand, I think, if you're the chairman, I don't do non-exec jobs by and large, because I discovered years ago, when I was the chief executive, that all the non-executive directors used to sit there and say, look, I've got this idea, and you say, how interesting, and then ignore them completely. And I don't think that's changed over the years. I don't think... so if you're a non-executive director, by and large, you're there for when the shit hits the fan, really. You're there for when it all goes wrong. The chairman has a different relationship. The chairman is about having a relationship with the chief executive and the senior staff. And I worked for very good chairmen, and I learnt from them. And the real point is, if you're the chairman, don't try and run the business yourself. You'll only screw it up. Your job is to understand, to decide if the chief executive is the right person, decide if the team around him are the right person, the right people, and offer them encouragement at difficult times, come up with ideas, throw in good ideas, and that. But it's not to be actively involved in the running of the business. Because I think if you do, no one will then know who's in charge. And my view is, in most businesses, or in almost all businesses, the chief executive should be in charge.
Good. Otherwise, you might end up with another email like at the BBC.
Yeah.
Just to prove the technology works, we've got a couple of questions. Let's take the second one on the list there, which is, what's your vision for Vine Hotels as a management company in terms of growth? Will you stay mainly in the north?
I doubt whether we'll stay mainly in the north. I doubt. We could go into London, but I think that's more difficult. It's based in the north. We're over supplied in Sheffield at the moment. I think we've got quite a lot of Sheffield. I think it depends what opportunities come up and whether we think they're profitable opportunities for us. I think it's as simple as that. We're looking at quite a few at the moment, and we're looking at a few to buy and also some others to manage.
So case by case.
Well, you can only do it by that, can't you? Mm. You can't do it. I mean, you know, who knows what's for sale next, and whether you can buy it, whether you can get the right deal. As I say, we walked away from one quite recently that, although the deal was just didn't think. As I say, you've got to go back to you keep going back to the recession. I mean, it seems to me there's two big factors. One is what happened in the recession, and can we live through that? And two, what's the competition? Is there any new competition coming around here? And if there is, will we compete?
Okay, thank you. Greg, regretfully, we're going to have to leave it there because time is against us, but please give Greg your normal support and thank him for his interesting speech.